Privyet and welcome. This short film will look at a social and cultural change in Russia from 1880 to 1914, focusing on the peasants, nobles, middle classes and working and living conditions. The workforce grew rapidly in the 1800s. By 1900, the total number of urban workers was 3 million, although this was only 2.5% of the overall population. Despite this leading to mass migration to cities, ex-peasants kept tied to their old villages, with 90% of sending money back to their relatives.
Many workers were employed in large factories containing thousands of others. Working conditions were poor. 11-hour days in cramped, harsh environments where the smallest of mistakes were punished physically or with fines. Accidents causing death or serious injury were common, and high rates of disease were ever present. Wages were often low, apart from a small selection of skilled workers. In the 1890s, jobs were not secure, and in some factories the labour force changed regularly, making it hard to be financially well off as a worker. This also allowed owners to be harsher with employees, as they wouldn't have anywhere else to go if they quit. Some factories had dormitory accommodation attached. Living conditions were often dirty and unsanitary, with people living on top of each other in overcrowded rooms. It was not uncommon for people coming off shifts to get straight into the beds of others about to start work. The dormitories also had poor sanitation, with outbreaks of typhus common in the factories of St. Petersburg.
In areas outside the central agricultural regions, especially those near to cities, many peasants enjoyed higher standards of living. The improved transport links allowed peasants to sell produce to market, allowing them to pay taxes and mortgages with money to spare. This created a small but growing class of prosperous peasants. In many parts of Russia, however, things did not change. Living standards remained low, with peasants struggling to get by. Many households couldn't feed themselves without getting into debt, and with diseases such as typhus and syphilis rife, most peasants didn't live long. The traditional way of life remained, and the patriarchal nature of the family also did, with the man being the head of the household. Women's rights remained restricted, with them having clearly defined tasks. Despite all the hardships, the peasants still strongly believed that the land belonged to the people who worked it, and they wanted to get their hands on the great estates and the land they rented from the gentry. Life also changed dramatically for the nobility in the decades after emancipation. The traditional view is that they were in decline. They had lost land, serfs, their status and control of the peasantry, and although generously compensated, much of this money had been used to pay off debts and mortgages. An increasing number of nobles sold their land. In 1861, they owned 80% of land. In 1905, only 40%, and they sold it mainly to peasants. An old way of life was ending, and many nobles were unhappy to see it disappear. They moved to cities and towns in ever-increasing numbers. However, historians like Seymour Becker maintain that many nobles successfully adapted to their changing circumstances and forged new careers and paths.
Many historians prefer to talk of middling groups rather than middle classes in Russia because they were not like the bourgeoisie in other parts of Europe. Though small in number, around 2 million, the business and professional classes were growing and playing an increasingly important role in society. There were probably around 1 million professionals by 1914. The number of doctors grew from 17,000 in 1897 to 28,000 in 1914. The number of teachers had almost doubled between 1906 and 1914 to over 20,000. There were 5,000 veterinary surgeons and 4,000 qualified agronomists in 1914.
The 1860s to 1880s were the golden age for Russian literature. Writers such as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky and Maxim Gorky were writing about the social changes in Russia at the time. Dostoevsky was arrested and sentenced to death for his involvement in an underground anti-government group, but later converted to orthodoxy for salvation. Leo Tolstoy was one of the most renowned writers of his time. He had fought in the Crimean War, and his experiences later contributed to his greatest work, War and Peace. Tolstoy's novels mainly focused on morality and philosophy, idolising the peasantry and attacking the wealthy.
By the time Chekhov wrote The Cherry Orchard in 1904, his reputation was only second to Tolstoy. The play The Cherry Orchard is a satire of the old world gentry and the cult of rural Russia. The main family are forced by debt to sell of their prized possession, the cherry orchard, to a former serf after the emancipation. This play was the first of its kind to glorify the lower classes of society. Let's have a look at that play. My beloved cherry orchard, why do I have to sell it to you?
Oh yes, thank you.
This beautiful orchard, our beautiful orchard. After how many stormy autumns every year, gripped by winter, my orchard is always young again, full of happiness and life.
Talk all you like about whatever you want, but know this. Come August 22nd, this whole place will be up for sale unless you can find the money to pay for your debts. So decide. You all decide. But I have my plan and I can't see another way out.
Where are the schools? The libraries? Where's all the money going? On roads? This wealth from industry and enterprise, where is it all going?
The years between 1880 and 1914 were ones of drastic social and cultural change in Russia. The peasantry gaining more land and freedom changed the way Russian society was made up forever, and in turn started to bring the influence of the nobility down further and further, as demonstrated in the cherry orchard. The mass movement of the people into cities to work and to live also broke up age-old traditions of the working class, and the emergence of middle classes showed that social mobility was finally being introduced. However, despite vast economical and monetary gains in this period, the gap between rich and poor still remained substantial, and this in turn sowed the seeds for what was to come in the Revolution.